Well, as the law stands, if you're a tenant, business or residential, you're obliged to pay rent. If you have an understanding landlord, rentals can be negotiated through the lockdown period. However, that's not always the case. The South African Independent Tenants Association is now proposing a joint legal action against landlords. It hopes that will see some relief for tenants. Dr. Ivor Blumenthal is the CEO of the South African Independent Tenants Association. He joins us. Now, Dr. Blumenthal, good evening to you. Commercial tenants, shops, restaurants, they don't seem to have any choice but to pay the rent. Is there anything they can do in a negotiation with the landlord?
Well, we think it's insidious, quite frankly, Stephen, that on the one hand, tenants have no income whatsoever. They literally are shut down for a couple of months in the lockdown. And yet, for landlords, it's business as usual, with possibly them deferring a little bit of the rental, which means they're going to get their money ultimately, and some of them discounting the rental. But in exchange, they want an extension of the lease for a minimum of a year at a time. Some of them a lot more amenable. And what we're saying ultimately at the end of the day is unless we get a go to court, unless we get initially a high court solution, and we anticipate eventually a constitutional court solution that says that landlords cannot somehow discount the effect of force majeure or an act of God, and somehow say that despite those activities, despite the force majeure, the tenant is still responsible for paying the lease, even though they have no income whatsoever. There's something wrong with that. And we're going to court, and we're going to court en masse as a collective to say to the courts, please give us a directive. Are we insane for thinking that what's good for the tenant should be good for the landlord? And quite frankly, what is the role of the Department of Trade and Industry in this? Because quite frankly, they've been noticeable by their absence in not getting involved and not protecting the tenant, and in particular the small tenants. And small tenants are retail businesses are going out of business left, right and center because of this unfair imbalance between landlord on the one hand and tenants on the other.
Dr. Blumenthal, I like a story where the good person wins as much as anybody, but this is the law we're talking about. It's not always about that. Let me put it to you another way. Judges can only interpret law. They can't make law, right? They can't insert a clause about a pandemic into a contract if it's not there. They can't reinterpret the law around force majeure if a pandemic is not there. Can they really make much of a difference?
Well, we're not asking judges to make new law. We are asking judges to say whether or not a landlord contracting out of their accountability and responsibility for force majeure for an act of God, just as a tenant would be, or any other organization instructed by the president to lock down, if landlords are somehow above the law in that regard, or whether they are subject to exactly the same law that a tenant would be subject to.
I mean, it's exactly the same as a story that we did recently around insurance claims. If it's not in the document, it's not in the document.
Well, that's a whole new ball game as far as insurance companies are concerned, and the potential for collusion between insurance companies and insurance brokers not to bring pandemic insurance to tenants in particular, our members. But at this moment in time, we're talking about landlords, and very squarely we are saying we would like a court to comment on whether or not landlords are somehow able to hold themselves above the law, the general law, the principles of force majeure, and possibly whether or not what they've inserted into their contracts are legal clauses or not.
Look, the legal textbooks around the world on force majeure are about to double in size. I think we can both agree on that. I do want to ask you this. The landlord makes money from the property, right? If the tenant doesn't pay, they evict the tenant. But there's no other tenant. I mean, no other restaurant can move in because restaurants aren't allowed to operate. No one's going to have startup capital to start a new restaurant. Doesn't that give your members some negotiating power?
Sure, it does. But the reality is this, the doors of the landlords to negotiation are closed. Initially, we had PIGS, and I didn't name them. They named themselves PIGS, the Property Industry Group, which was supposed to have sat down with tenants and engaged and negotiated. But in reality, all they did was unilaterally decide that they were going to put a take-it-or-leave-it approach to tenants, and most of those tenants being organizations making more than 80 million rand a year turnover. My members, at a ceiling, are making about 35 million rand a year in terms of turnover. They are the forgotten end of the spectrum of retail tenants.
Dr. Ivor Blumenthal, CEO of the South African Independent Tenants Association, really do appreciate the engagement.